The throne room of Queen Nixvara was designed to intimidate, and it succeeded magnificently. Captain Jonathan Blake stood with the human diplomatic delegation in the vast chamber, surrounded by towering obsidian columns carved with scenes of Zarathi conquests. The queen herself sat upon a throne that seemed to be carved from a single massive crystal, her imposing figure draped in ceremonial armor that gleamed like liquid mercury. Nixvara was everything the intelligence briefings had described and more, nearly 7 feet tall, with the distinctive violet skin and silver hair of the Zarathi royal bloodline. Her golden eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of the assembled dignitaries with predatory precision. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through the chamber's acoustics, ensuring that every word was felt as well as heard. Representatives of the human colonies, she began, her tone carrying the weight of absolute authority, you have come seeking trade agreements and mutual protection treaties. These things may be possible, if proper protocols are observed. Blake exchanged glances with Ambassador Chen, the head of their delegation. The Zarathi were known for their complex diplomatic rituals, but something in the Queen's manner suggested this wasn't going to be a routine negotiation. However, Nixvara continued, rising from her throne with fluid grace, before any external agreements can be finalized, internal matters of state must be resolved. The Zarathi nobles assembled in the throne room shifted uneasily, a ripple of tension passing through their ranks like wine through wheat. Blake noticed several of the male courtiers suddenly finding reasons to examine the floor rather than meet their queen's gaze. The royal bloodline requires continuity, Nixvara announced, her voice growing stronger, more commanding. The crown requires the stability that only a proper consort can provide. Therefore, I declare my immediate need for a husband. The silence that followed was so profound that Blake could hear his own heartbeat. Around the throne room, Zarathi warriors, beings legendary throughout the galaxy for their courage in battle, were suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere or developing fascinating interests in the chamber's architectural details. I will choose from among those present, the queen continued, her golden eyes sweeping the assembled males with something that might have been desperation masked as royal command. Any who consider themselves worthy may step forward now. Blake watched in growing amazement as not a single Zarathi male moved. These were warriors who faced plasma cannons without flinching, tacticians who had conquered star systems, nobles who claimed descent from legendary heroes. And every single one of them was suddenly finding excuses to avoid their queen's attention. Fascinating, murmured Dr. Reyes, the expedition's xenoanthropologist. The queen's reputation appears to exceed even our intelligence estimates. Blake had read those intelligence reports. Queen Nixvara had ruled Zarathia for 8 years, during which she had married 3 times. All 3 husbands had died under what were diplomatically termed unusual circumstances, though the details were carefully obscured in official Zarathi records. Your Majesty, ventured one elderly noble, his voice barely above a whisper, perhaps this matter could be postponed until a more auspicious time. There is no more auspicious time than now, Nixvara replied, her tone carrying a dangerous edge. I have waited long enough for my people to provide suitable candidates. If none among you possess the courage to approach, then perhaps courage is a quality my bloodline should seek elsewhere. Her gaze swept the room again, lingering this time on the human delegation. Blake found himself being studied with an intensity that was both analytical and oddly hopeful. The Zarathi speak often of strength and honor, she continued, her voice growing colder as she addressed her own people. Yet when your queen requires a consort worthy of sharing the burdens of rule, you cower like children afraid of shadows. Blake looked around the throne room, taking in the full scope of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just political theater, it was genuine desperation masked as royal prerogative. The queen needed a husband to maintain her political legitimacy according to Zarathi custom, but her reputation had made her untouchable. Perhaps, Blake said quietly to Ambassador Chen, the queen's reputation isn't entirely accurate. Captain Blake, Chen whispered back urgently, do not even consider whatever you're thinking. 3 previous husbands, all dead. The Zarathi call her the Widow Queen for good reason. Do they? Or do they call her that because it's easier than acknowledging that she's been politically isolated by circumstances beyond her control? Blake studied Nixvara more carefully, looking past the intimidating presence and legendary reputation. What he saw was someone maintaining regal composure while dealing with what was clearly a humiliating situation. Her people were publicly rejecting her, and she had to maintain dignity while her authority was being undermined by their fear. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing moment. Zarathi nobles whispered among themselves, but none moved forward. The queen's expression grew stonier, though Blake caught glimpses of something else underneath, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. "Very well," Nixvara said finally, her voice carrying bitter disappointment. "If none among my own people possess the courage." "Your Majesty," Blake interrupted, stepping forward before he could reconsider the decision. "I would be honored to be considered." The throne room erupted in shocked murmurs, gasps, and what sounded suspiciously like nervous laughter from several Zarathi courtiers. Ambassador Chen grabbed Blake's arm with an expression of pure horror. "Captain Blake, you cannot be serious." "Completely serious," Blake replied, gently extracting himself from the ambassador's grip and continuing his approach toward the throne. Queen Nixvara stared at him with an expression Blake couldn't quite interpret. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been relief mixed with wariness. "Human," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that wasn't quite mockery, "do you understand what you are volunteering for? I understand that your Majesty requires a consort, and that circumstances have made that requirement difficult to fulfill through traditional means." Blake stopped at the appropriate distance from the throne and executed what he hoped was a proper Zarathi formal bow. "I also understand that marriage between our species would create unprecedented opportunities for diplomatic and cultural exchange. You understand that my previous husbands all died? I understand that your previous husbands all faced the dangerous realities of Zarathi royal politics. I believe I'm better prepared for those challenges than they were." Nixvara rose from her throne and stepped down to Blake's level, her impressive height allowing her to look down at him even when they were both standing. This close, Blake could see that her golden eyes held intelligence and complexity that the intimidating throne room presence had concealed. "And what makes you believe that, human?" Blake met her gaze steadily. "Because I'm not afraid of you, Your Majesty. And I think that might be exactly what you need." For the first time since he'd entered the throne room, Queen Nixvara smiled. It was a small expression, quickly controlled, but Blake caught it. And in that moment, he realized he might have just made the most important decision of his life, or the last one. The silence in the throne room was different now, not the Queen Nixvara circled Blake slowly, her golden eyes studying him with the same intensity she might use to evaluate a battle plan. The throne room remained silent, the assembled Zarathi nobles watching this unprecedented scene with mixtures of fascination and horror. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed designed to unsettle, "what do you know of Zarathi marriage customs?" "I know they're based on strength, compatibility, and mutual benefit to the bloodlines involved," Blake replied calmly. "I know the consort must be able to withstand political pressure, physical danger, and the complex social dynamics of royal court life." "And you believe you possess these qualities?" "I believe I possess qualities that might complement yours in ways that traditional Zarathi suitors cannot." Nixvara paused in her circling, one eyebrow raised in what might have been amusement. "Elaborate." Blake was aware that every word of this conversation would be analyzed, reported, and potentially used against him later. But he was also aware that this might be his only chance to prove his point. "Your Majesty has ruled Zarathia successfully for 8 years, maintaining stability during a period of significant galactic upheaval. You've done this while dealing with internal political pressures that would have destroyed lesser leaders." Blake kept his voice steady, professional. "But you've had to do it largely alone, because the traditional pool of potential consorts sees you as too dangerous to approach. And you do not. I see you as someone dealing with an impossible situation with remarkable grace." Blake met her gaze directly. "Your previous husbands failed not because you were dangerous to them, but because they weren't prepared for the dangers that come with being close to power. A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the assembled nobles. Several courtiers looked scandalized at Blake's casual analysis of royal marriages. "You speak very boldly about matters you understand imperfectly," Nixvara said, though her tone carried more curiosity than warning. "Then help me understand them better. What really happened to your previous husbands?" The silence that followed was absolute. Blake realized he had just asked a question that no one in the Zarathi court had dared voice for years. Nixvara was still for a long moment, then resumed her slow circling. "The first died in what appeared to be a hunting accident. The second succumbed to a wasting illness that our physicians could neither identify nor cure. The third was killed by assassins who were never captured. All of which," Blake said carefully, "suggests they were targeted by enemies of the crown rather than harmed by their proximity to you personally. A distinction without a difference, human. The result is the same. The result is 3 tragedies. But the cause is political opposition, not personal danger from your majesty." Nixvara stopped circling and faced him directly. "And you believe you would fare better against such opposition?" "I believe I would approach the situation differently. Your previous husbands were Zarathi nobles with established positions in your society. I'm an outsider with no existing factional loyalties and extensive training in threat assessment and personal security." Blake allowed himself a small smile. "Also, humans are famously difficult to kill." That last comment drew what sounded suspiciously like snorts of laughter from several younger courtiers, quickly suppressed when Nixvara's gaze swept in their direction. "You find this amusing?" she asked Blake. "I find it challenging. Your Majesty needs a consort who can survive the political realities of royal marriage while providing genuine support for your rule. Traditional candidates have failed because they weren't prepared for those realities. I believe I am. Because you're human. Because I'm trained for exactly these kinds of complex, dangerous situations." Blake gestured slightly toward the assembled court. Diplomatic missions to potentially hostile societies, navigating political intrigues where the wrong word can start wars, maintaining professional relationships while managing personal safety, that's my job description. Nixvara was quiet for several minutes, studying Blake with an intensity that made several nearby nobles visibly uncomfortable. "There is another consideration," she said finally. "Which is compatibility. Zarathi royal marriages require more than political alliance, they require personal connection." Blake felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized what she was asking about. "Your Majesty, I understand that Zarathi physiology and human physiology are compatible in that regard. Understanding and experiencing are different things." "True. But compatibility involves more than just physical considerations. It requires mutual respect, shared goals, complementary strengths." Blake paused, choosing his words carefully. "It requires seeing each other as complete persons rather than just political assets or physical attractions." "And you believe you can see me as a complete person?" Blake looked at her, really looked, not at the impressive royal presence or the intimidating reputation, but at the individual managing an impossible situation with dignity and intelligence. "I see someone who has been forced into isolation by circumstances beyond her control. Someone who needs a partner, not just a consort. Someone who deserves to be valued for her intelligence and leadership abilities, not just feared for her power." Blake's voice softened slightly. "I see someone who stepped forward to lead her people through difficult times, just like I try to do in my own role." Nixvara's expression shifted subtly, showing something that might have been vulnerability before her royal composure reasserted itself. "The traditional courtship trials begin tomorrow," she announced, her voice carrying formal authority. "If you truly wish to be considered, you will participate in the tests of strength, wisdom, and loyalty that determine a suitor's worthiness." "I accept," Blake replied immediately. "These trials were designed for Zarathi males. They may not be appropriate for human physiology." Blake smiled. Your Majesty, I've spent my career adapting to situations I wasn't specifically designed for. I think I can handle whatever challenges your traditions present. Very well. Nixvara turned to address the assembled court. Let it be recorded that Captain Jonathan Blake of the Human Colonies has requested formal consideration as royal consort. The traditional trials will commence at dawn. As the court began to disperse with excited whispers and shocked conversations, Nixvara approached Blake one final time. Human, she said quietly, are you certain you understand what you have committed yourself to? I understand that tomorrow I'll face challenges designed to test whether I'm worthy of being your partner. I understand that success means taking on responsibilities and dangers that have already claimed 3 lives. And I understand that failure probably means death. Blake met her golden gaze steadily. What I don't understand is why someone like you has had to face all of this alone for so long. For just a moment, Nixvara's regal composure slipped, revealing something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Then the mask returned, and she was once again the formidable Widow Queen. We shall see, Captain Blake. We shall see. As she swept from the throne room followed by her retinue, Blake was left standing alone, wondering if he had just volunteered for the most important mission of his career or the most elaborate suicide in diplomatic history. Ambassador Chen approached with an expression of profound concern. Blake, what have you done? I think, Blake said thoughtfully, I might have just offered to solve 2 problems at once. Which problems? Her isolation and my certainty that there's more to this situation than anyone wants to admit. As they left the throne, the arena where the courtship trials were held could have housed a small city. Blake stood in the center of the sand-covered floor, surrounded by thousands of Zarathi spectators who had come to witness what many were already calling the human's folly. High above in the royal viewing box, Queen Nixvara watched with an expression of careful neutrality, though Blake thought he detected traces of concern beneath her composed facade. The first trial, announced the Master of Ceremonies, his voice amplified to reach every corner of the arena, is the test of strength. The candidate must demonstrate his ability to protect the royal bloodline through combat prowess. Blake looked at the 3 Zarathi warriors approaching him across the sand, each one larger, stronger, and more heavily armed than the last. The crowd's anticipation was palpable, and Blake could hear betting odds being shouted in the stands. He was definitely not the favorite. Captain Blake, called one of the warriors, hefting a weapon that looked like a cross between a sword and a plasma rifle, it is not too late to withdraw with honor. Appreciate the offer, Blake replied, checking the ceremonial weapons he'd been provided, but I think I'll see how this plays out. The combat began immediately, with all 3 warriors attacking simultaneously. Blake's first realization was that trying to match Zarathi's strength would be suicide, they were simply too fast and too powerful for direct confrontation. His second realization was that the ceremonial weapons were designed for Zarathi fighting styles, not human ones. His third realization was that none of his opponents expected him to fight like a human rather than a Zarathi. Blake abandoned the traditional Zarathi combat stance and began using the mobility and tactical thinking that had kept him alive through a dozen diplomatic crises. Instead of standing and trading blows, he kept moving, using the arena's environment to his advantage. Instead of trying to overpower his opponents, he used their own momentum against them. The first warrior went down when Blake used a classic Earth martial arts technique to redirect the alien's charge into one of the arena's support pillars. The second fell victim to what Blake's instructor would have called creative use of available resources, in this case, a tactical roll that tangled the warrior's feet in the ceremonial banners hanging from the arena walls. The third warrior, however, was learning from his companion's defeats. He began fighting more cautiously, using his superior reach and strength to keep Blake at a disadvantage. That's when Blake stopped trying to fight like a warrior and started fighting like a diplomat. You know, Blake said, circling his opponent while deflecting increasingly aggressive attacks, this trial is supposed to test my ability to protect the queen, right? What of it? The warrior growled, pressing his attack. Well, the most dangerous threats to Her Majesty aren't going to announce themselves with formal challenges. They're going to be assassins, poisoners, political conspirators. Blake ducked under a swing that would have decapitated him. People who attack from shadows, not in open combat. Your point? My point is that the real question isn't whether I can defeat 3 warriors in formal combat. It's whether I can keep Her Majesty safe when the threats aren't so obvious. Blake suddenly changed tactics, moving not to defeat his opponent but to position himself between the warrior and the royal viewing box, as if the Zorathi fighter represented a threat to the queen. The crowd noticed immediately, their cheers shifting from bloodthirsty entertainment to something approaching approval. Blake wasn't just fighting, he was demonstrating exactly the protective instinct the trial was designed to test. When the combat ended with Blake successfully defending his position rather than achieving total victory, the arena fell into confused silence. Technically, he hadn't won in the traditional sense, but he had accomplished something more important. He had proven his understanding of what protecting the queen really meant. The second trial, the Master of Ceremonies announced after conferring with officials, is the test of wisdom. The candidate must demonstrate understanding of complex political and social situations. This trial took the form of a formal debate, with Blake required to analyze and propose solutions to various scenarios that might face the royal court. What surprised everyone, including Blake himself, was how well his diplomatic training translated to Zorathi political problems. The border dispute with the Kethmoran system, posed one of the examining nobles, requires resolution that maintains Zorathi honor while avoiding costly military action. Your recommendation? Blake considered the question, drawing on his experience with similar situations in human space. Negotiate a joint development agreement for the disputed mining rights. Both sides get economic benefit, honor is preserved through cooperation rather than conquest, and you establish precedent for resolving future disputes through mutual advantage. The examining nobles exchanged glances. Blake's suggestions were not only practical but showed an understanding of Zorathi values that most outsiders never achieved. The wisdom trial continued for 2 hours, covering everything from trade negotiations to succession laws to military strategy. Blake found himself genuinely engaged with the intellectual challenges, and he began to understand why Queen Nyxvara needed a consort who could contribute meaningfully to governance rather than just ceremonial support. The final trial, the Master of Ceremonies announced as the sun began to set, is the test of loyalty. The candidate must prove his absolute dedication to the royal bloodline above all other considerations. This trial was different from the others. Instead of a public spectacle, it took place in a smaller, more intimate setting with only the Queen, her closest advisors, and Blake present. What Blake didn't know was that it was also the most dangerous. The test appeared straightforward. Blake was placed in a scenario where he had to choose between his own safety and the Queen's welfare. What he didn't realize was that the scenario was real. The assassination attempt that unfolded around them had been arranged by the very nobles who opposed an alien consort. When armed figures burst into the chamber, Blake's reaction was immediate and instinctive. He didn't analyze the political implications or consider the possibility that this might be a test. He simply threw himself between the attackers and Nyxvara, using his own body as a shield while shouting for her guards. The attack lasted only minutes, but its effects were profound. Blake took 2 injuries that would require medical attention, but Nyxvara was unharmed. More importantly, his complete willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety had been witnessed by nobles who had previously questioned his motives. Well, Nyxvara said quietly as medical personnel tended to Blake's wounds, I believe that concludes the traditional trials. Did I pass? Blake asked, wincing as a medic sealed a plasma burn on his arm. You did something more interesting than pass, she replied. You redefined what the trials were supposed to measure. How so? The strength trial tests combat ability, but you demonstrated strategic thinking. The wisdom trial tests knowledge, but you showed genuine understanding. The loyalty trial tests dedication, but you proved that your commitment is instinctive rather than calculated. Blake looked around the chamber, noting the expressions of the assembled nobles. Where there had been skepticism and outright hostility before, he now saw something approaching respect. Your Majesty, he said carefully, what happens now? Now, Queen Nixvara replied, her golden eyes showing warmth he hadn't seen before, we find out whether a human and a Zarathi can build something stronger together than either could achieve alone. Is that what you want? Captain Blake, for 8 years I have ruled alone because no one was willing to share the dangers and responsibilities of the crown. Today, you proved that sharing those burdens doesn't require being Zarathi. It requires being brave enough to put someone else's welfare ahead of your own safety. Blake smiled, despite the pain from his injuries. Then yes, Your Majesty. I'd very much like to find out what we can build together. The formal announcement of their engagement would come later, but in that moment, as Queen Nixvara placed her hand gently over his injured one, Blake realized that he had found some. Blake should have expected that passing the traditional trials would be only the beginning of his challenges. 3 days after the formal announcement of his engagement to Queen Nixvara, he found himself facing a crisis that made the courtship trials seem like diplomatic formalities. The traditionalist faction has issued a formal challenge, reported Councillor Veltar, the Queen's chief advisor, his expression grim as he addressed the emergency council session. They claim the right of ritual combat to determine the worthiness of the proposed consort. Blake looked around the council chamber, reading the expressions of the assembled nobles. Some showed support, others revealed barely concealed hostility, but all carried the tension of people watching a situation spiral beyond anyone's control. Explain the parameters, Queen Nixvara commanded, though Blake could see the concern she was trying to hide behind royal composure. Single combat, to the death, against Champion Kethfor. The challenger has the right to choose weapons and fighting conditions. Veltar's voice carried the weight of someone delivering a death sentence. If Captain Blake refuses, the engagement is nullified and he is exiled from Zarathi space. If he accepts and loses, he dies, Nixvara finished flatly. Your Majesty, Blake interjected, who is Champion Kethfor? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Veltar provided the details anyway. Kethfor is the greatest warrior of his generation. Undefeated in formal combat for 12 years. He has killed 23 opponents in ritual duels and has never shown mercy to those who face him. Blake nodded thoughtfully. And if I defeat him? Impossible, stated Duke Nextor, leader of the traditionalist faction, from his position across the chamber. But if such a miracle occurred, it would establish your worthiness beyond any further question. Your Majesty, Blake said, addressing Nixvara directly, what are my actual options here? I can use royal prerogative to cancel the combat, she replied, though her tone suggested she already knew his response to that possibility. Which would accomplish what? It would save your life and completely undermine my authority. Nixvara's golden eyes met his with a mixture of affection and frustration. The court would see it as proof that my judgment is compromised by personal attachment, and my political enemies would use it to destabilize the throne. Blake studied the faces around the council chamber, reading the political currents with skills honed through years of diplomatic crisis management. And if I accept the combat and lose? Then the traditionalists get what they want, confirmation that humans are unworthy of royal connection, and I'm back to being the untouchable widow queen. But if I accept and win? Then you prove that strength takes many forms, and our marriage becomes a symbol of Zarathi evolution rather than degradation. Blake was quiet for several minutes, considering not just the immediate choice but its larger implications. Around the chamber, nobles waited with the tense anticipation of people watching history unfold. I accept Champion Kethfor's challenge, Blake announced. The reaction was immediate and mixed, gasps of horror from some quarters, nods of approval from others, and from Queen Nixvara, an expression of pride mixed with terror. Captain Blake, Duke Nextor said with barely concealed satisfaction, you understand that this is ritual combat to the death. There will be no surrender, no mercy, no intervention. I understand completely. And you understand that Champion Kethfor has never been defeated? I understand that he's never faced someone who fights the way I do. Blake met the Duke's gaze steadily. When and where? Tomorrow at dawn, in the Great Arena. Traditional weapons only, no human technology. After the council dismissed, Blake found himself alone with Nixvara in her private chambers. The queen, who had maintained perfect composure during the public session, now showed the strain of someone watching the person she cared about walk toward almost certain death. "Jonathan," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time, "you don't have to do this. I can find other ways to deal with the traditionalist opposition." "What ways?" "Exile them. Execute them. Spend the rest of your reign looking over your shoulder for the next challenge." Blake moved closer, taking her hands in his. "Your Majesty, Nixvara, this isn't just about us anymore. It's about what kind of society Zarathia is going to become." "What do you mean?" "Your people are at a crossroads. They can continue isolating themselves, rejecting outside influences, maintaining traditions that no longer serve their best interests. Or they can evolve, adapt, find strength in diversity rather than just in conformity." Blake squeezed her hands gently. "This combat isn't really about whether I'm worthy to be your husband. It's about whether Zarathia is ready to embrace a broader definition of strength. And if you lose, then I lose. But at least I'll have tried to prove a point worth proving." Nixvara stared at him for a long moment, then pulled him into an embrace that spoke of desperation and admiration in equal measure. "You impossible, stubborn, brave human," she whispered against his shoulder. "How did you become someone I can't bear to lose?" "The same way you became someone worth risking everything for," Blake replied, holding her close. "By being exactly who we are, instead of who everyone else expects us to be." That night, Blake prepared for combat not by training with weapons he barely knew how to use, but by studying everything he could find about Champion Kethvor's fighting style, psychological profile, and previous victories. "He's stronger than you, faster than you, and more skilled with traditional weapons," observed Dr. Reyes, who had insisted on helping despite the diplomatic complications. "By every objective measure, this should be a slaughter." "Should be," Blake agreed. "But combat isn't just about objective measures. It's about psychology, adaptation, and understanding your opponent's assumptions." "Explain." "Kethvor has never lost because he's never faced anyone who fights fundamentally differently than he does. Every opponent he's defeated has tried to beat him at his own game, strength against strength, speed against speed, traditional technique against traditional technique. And you're going to do what instead?" Blake smiled grimly. "I'm going to fight like a human who's spent his career surviving situations he wasn't designed for." The next morning, the great arena was filled to capacity with spectators from across Zarathia and beyond. Word had spread throughout the sector that a human diplomat was challenging the legendary champion Kethvor for the right to marry the Widow Queen. Blake entered the arena to a mixture of cheers and jeers, but his attention was focused on his opponent. Champion Kethvor was everything the reports had described, nearly 8 feet tall, massively muscled, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had never met his equal in combat. "Human," Kethvor called across the sand, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the arena, "I will make your death as quick as possible, out of respect for your courage in facing me." "I appreciate that," Blake replied, testing the weight of his ceremonial sword. "But I should probably warn you, I don't plan on dying today." The combat began with Kethvor's typical overwhelming assault, designed to end fights quickly through superior force and intimidation. But Blake wasn't there when the attack landed. He was already moving, using mobility and tactical positioning in ways that no previous opponent had attempted. The royal wedding of Queen Nixvara and champion Jonathan Blake was unlike anything in Zarathi history, not just because it united two species, but because it represented the conscious evolution of an entire culture. Blake stood at the altar in the Great Temple, wearing ceremonial robes that somehow managed to honor both human and Zarathi traditions. Beside him, Queen Nixvara was resplendent in armor-like wedding attire that proclaimed her both warrior and bride, ruler and partner. The ceremony itself had been adapted to accommodate both species' customs. Blake had insisted on including the human tradition of exchanging personal vows, while Nixvara had maintained the Zarathi ritual of blade bonding, where marriage partners demonstrate their trust by allowing each other to draw ceremonial cuts that would heal into matching scars. People of Zarathia, Nixvara began, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed temple, today we witness not just a marriage, but the birth of a new understanding. Blake watched the assembled crowd, nobles who had initially opposed their union now sitting beside human diplomats, warriors who had once viewed him with suspicion now offering respectful nods, citizens who had traveled from across the planet to witness this historic moment. When I first announced my need for a husband, the Queen continued, I expected to find someone who would complement my existing strengths. What I found instead was someone who challenged me to discover new ones. She turned to Blake, her golden eyes bright with emotion that would have been unthinkable for the isolated widow queen to display publicly just months earlier. Jonathan Blake, you stepped forward when no one else would. Not because you weren't afraid, but because you believed something was worth the risk. You showed me that strength isn't about standing alone, it's about choosing the right people to stand with. Blake took her hands, feeling the calluses from sword work alongside the gentler marks of someone who had learned to trust another's touch. Nixvara, he said, using the informal name that still drew gasps from traditional courtiers, when I volunteered to be your consort, I thought I was offering a diplomatic solution to a political problem. What I discovered was that I was really volunteering to become part of something larger than either of us could achieve alone. The blade bonding ceremony that followed was perhaps the most symbolic moment of the entire event. The traditional ritual required each partner to draw blood from the other using ceremonial knives, demonstrating absolute trust and creating permanent marks of their union. As Blake carefully drew the ritual cut across Nixvara's palm, he marveled at the trust it represented. This formidable queen allowing someone to wound her in front of her entire court, confident that he would do only what was necessary and nothing more. When she performed the same ritual on him, her touch was steady and sure, but Blake could see the concentration it required. The widow queen who had once been feared for her deadly touch was now demonstrating the most intimate kind of care. With this blade and this blood, they spoke together in the ancient formula, we bind not just our lives but our purposes. What threatens one threatens both. What strengthens one strengthens both. The celebration that followed the ceremony revealed how much had changed in Zarathi society. Human and Zarathi music blended in ways that created entirely new harmonies. Diplomatic protocols gave way to genuine conversations as species barriers dissolved in the shared joy of the occasion. Blake found himself in conversation with Champion Kethvor, who had become one of his strongest supporters after their arena combat. Champion Blake, Kethvor said, raising his ceremonial cup in a toast, you have taught us that victory takes many forms. What do you mean? Your defeat of me in the arena was important, but it was not the real victory. The real victory was showing us that we could change without losing who we are. Blake looked around the great hall, seeing Zarathi nobles engaged in animated discussions with human diplomats, seeing barriers that had stood for centuries crumbling in the face of shared understanding. I think we're all still learning what victory looks like, Blake replied. Later, as the formal celebrations wound down, Blake and Nixvara found themselves alone on the palace balcony, looking out over a city that seemed somehow different than it had just hours earlier. Any regrets? Nixvara asked, echoing the question Blake had posed to her during their early conversations. About marrying the most formidable woman in the galaxy. About taking on responsibilities that have already claimed 3 lives. About helping to reshape the political landscape of an entire world. Blake smiled and pulled her closer. None whatsoever. Even though you've given up your human diplomatic career to become a Zarathi royal consort. I haven't given up anything. I've gained everything I didn't know I wanted. Blake looked at her seriously. Nixvara, I spent my entire career being the person who went where others couldn't or wouldn't go, who solved problems others thought were impossible. But I always did it alone, and I always moved on when the job was done. And now? Now I've found someone worth staying for. Someone whose problems are interesting enough to spend a lifetime solving together. Nixvara laughed, the sound carrying joy that would have been impossible for the lonely widow queen to express. Speaking of problems we'll solve together, she said, the Galactic Council has requested a formal meeting to discuss the new diplomatic possibilities our union creates. When? Next month. Apparently, our marriage has generated significant interest in human Zarathi cultural exchange programs. Blake nodded thoughtfully. Makes sense. We've proven that cooperation between our species is possible on the most personal level. That opens possibilities for cooperation on much larger scales. Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility? Being seen as a symbol of interspecies cooperation. Blake considered the question, thinking about the path that had led him from a routine diplomatic mission to marriage with an alien queen to becoming a bridge between worlds. I'm prepared to be what we've always been. Two people who chose to trust each other enough to build something stronger together than either could achieve alone. And if that example inspires others, then maybe we'll have accomplished something worth all the risks we took to get here. As they stood together on the balcony, Blake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He had stepped forward when others stepped back, not because he was fearless but because he recognized that some things were worth being afraid for. Nixvara had found in him not just a husband but a partner who saw her strength as something to be supported rather than feared, who understood that true power was amplified rather than diminished when shared with someone worthy of trust. One more question, Blake said as they prepared to return to their chambers. Yes. What happens tomorrow? After all the ceremonies and celebrations, when we actually have to figure out how to rule together. Nixvara smiled, her golden eyes bright with anticipation rather than concern. Tomorrow, we start building the future we convinced everyone was possible. We prove that the marriage was just the beginning, not the end goal. Together. Together. As they walked back into the palace, Blake realized that he had found something he had never expected to discover, not just love that transcended species barriers, but a partnership based on mutual respect, shared challenges, and the recognition that the most meaningful victories were the ones that created possibilities for others to achieve their own victories in turn. The human who had dared to step forward when no one else would have found his place in the universe. Not as a conqueror or a savior, but as someone who chose to build bridges instead of walls, who proved that courage and compassion could coexist, and who discovered that the greatest adventures were the ones you shared with someone brave enough to dream of impossible futures and stubborn enough to make them reality.